Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Andre and I'm your bookworm, and today we're back on Book Chat, and today the topic will be villains. Top 5 villains for me at least. So, what are great villains? I think this topic is super subjective. I think I need to say that right off the bat because what I think is a good villain depends a lot on what I like about the villains themselves. So, this top 5 will be very different from your top 5 and from everyone else's top 5. I bet if I asked you, and everyone pretty much would give a different top 5 depending on the books they've read, depending on what they think makes a good villain. But so this video will be just some of these, the top 5 for me, and I'm gonna give a bit of reasons why I think they are good villains and regarding the series they have. But because of this, it means that this video will be super spoilery. So if you don't like any spoilers, just skip this video altogether. You have plenty of other videos on the channel to watch if you want. Otherwise, you can stick around, you can comment, interact all the time, and let's get on with it. All right, first villain, we're gonna start off with my favorite fantasy series because it has so many good villains, and I'm talking about The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. If you don't know what Wheel of Time is, it's a 14-book series. It's been fully published. I have read and reviewed every single book here on the channel. You can check them out through the thumbnails or the cards up above. And because it's such a huge series and it has so many characters in it, a lot of them will be villains, and a lot of them are very good villains. And I think they span a whole range of groups of people, sex, gender, everything. So I think Wheel of Time really excels both on heroes and villains. And I mean, some of these villains you only see in a couple of books, others they span the whole series. So there is a gradient between some villains that are almost forgettable to some villains that are just epic and they are just memorable since you read them till the end of your life, I guess. So there are a lot of options. The one I am going for is my favorite villain, which is Ishamael. Ishamael is a Forsaken from this series, which is considered a group of villains that are just under the Dark One, who is this entity that basically the entity of evil in the world. So the Forsaken are the 13 that chose to pursue their lives and their aspirations with the Dark One, and Ishamael is one of them. Why is Ishamael so good for me, in my opinion? I think partially is the reason why he became evil. So we follow this character since the very start of the series up until the very end. And there are some changes that this character goes through, but throughout the books we get the information that Ishamael was a philosopher in a long time ago. And in his philosophy, he realized that no matter what he did, evil would eventually win. And that is because of the whole philosophy around this world. In the Wheel of Time, they have the belief that the wheel keeps turning, and with every turn is a new age. And so every age, eventually the Dark One will come out, and people will have to defeat him to continue living. Otherwise, the Dark One will rule everything, will destroy the wheel, and it will be the end of everything as we know. Now, Ishamael, who was a philosopher, he simply thought, well, if the wheel will ever keep turning and there will be an infinite number of ages, then for sure there will be one age where the Dark One will win. So why fight it? We might as well just join them all together and accelerate the process. And I think that is such a logical thing to say. You cannot refute it because he is right. If there are infinite possibilities, then there is a certain time where the Dark One will win. But of course, it's always a bit defeatist to think, oh, since we're going to lose, might as well just join the winning side so that we can win even faster or something like that. So it is defeatist, but I think it makes him such a great villain because you know that he is not villain from his very sense of self. He becomes villain due to the acts that he does, wanting to kill Rand, our main protagonist, and becoming his arch nemesis throughout the series. And I think, of course, there are other villains in this series that represent slightly different things, like, for example, a fanatism of trying to be too lawful that you become evil in a way, or an evil that is so evil that kind of consumes itself. There are several different facets of villainy in Wheel of Time. However, I think Ishamael is a good villain because of the reason why he became a villain, and not only simply because he's too evil. All right, our second example comes from science fiction, from a series that I have read here on the channel, but we're focusing only on the first book, who is called Hyperion, written by Dan Simmons. I have read this book and the whole series here on the channel. You can check out the thumbnails as well, or the cards up above, if you want to know the actual reviews. But in regards to the villain, I am talking about an entity that shows up, doesn't speak, but the mere presence is scary. It's evil, and I am talking about the Shrike. And I think this villain is interesting in an opposite way to Ishamael. You barely know anything about it. You just see the Shrike appear from time to time. Every time it appears, it's in a very grim or very scary scene, and what he does is also very scary, very evil. So there's this presence that is so terrifying whenever it shows up that just creates this aura around it, even though you don't know much about the Shrike. And I think Dan Simmons did it very well by not giving many details about it, because that's the best thing. And the reason why is because your imagination will fill in the blanks. And our imagination is our worst enemy because it will fill it with the scariest thing we can imagine. And even though the Shrike later on in the following books doesn't really continue as a villain and we eventually get some sort of redemption arc for it, in the first book you don't know anything, and therefore it is always super scary as a character. And I think this can only be compared, for example, with Sauron from The Lord of the Rings, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Why did I not mention that one? I think because it's such a classical example, and I also wanted to mention something from science fiction. I feel like the Shrike caused more fear in me than Sauron, maybe because the difference between, I don't know really, but the Shrike was scarier. Anyways, J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, Sauron. It's also an entity. We don't know much about it in The Lord of the Rings. We just know that it is this ever-present thing that is always looking for the ring, that is a threat to our main protagonist. And we know that it can see everything, so almost everything. It's so omnipresent throughout the series that it becomes quite scary just for its existence. And I think the Shrike has a very similar attitude in terms of its villainy. So I think Ishamael and the Shrike are very villainous for very different reasons. And now I'm going to introduce a third example that is also quite different from these two. Okay, the villain for this series is a series that is between fantasy and science fiction. Actually, it's a mixture of the two, and I'm talking about the Dark Tower series written by Stephen King. And in this case, I'm talking about all the series, not just a particular book. And I have read all of the series. I don't have any reviews here on the channel, but my overall review is I liked the series as a whole. Some of the books I thought they were very average. I liked it more towards the end than at the start. And why is that? I think that is exactly because of our main character, who is Roland, who in some way becomes a villain. And I know a lot of people disagree with this. I think a lot of people categorize him as an anti-hero, which I think is a lot more accurate than calling him a villain. However, I think that he becomes a villain as he progresses through the series. And at the end, I think we should truly call him a villain because of his choices. He chooses to sacrifice people. We reach the end of the series, and this is like the biggest spoiler of the series. So if you've never read the series, I recommend for the ending because it's one of the best endings in any fantasy series. But basically, he realizes that he's in a loop and he's always going through to get to the tower. And we realize that every single time he sacrifices the same people, he chooses the same things, and he just keeps going on this loop, which is sad, but it's also evil to always have that choice and always choose to sacrifice people and to do all the things he does. But then again, this is one of those series where you don't see him as a villain until the very end. And actually, even at the end, when you realize everything, you still feel a bit of sadness for him. But the more you think about it, the more you can see him as a villain through and through. And this is the first villain that strikes really as mean or evil, because Ishamael did things by logic, simply because he thought, okay, we're not going to win, I'm just going to do that, which is evil and it's villainous. Whereas the Shrike is just being there is scary. Whereas this one, it's like a more real threat, and that causes fear in itself. And the choices that he does is fully conscious, so we know as well that he is just villainous for the purpose of himself. He is kind of an egotistical villainous, if we can call him that. Now, I'm gonna jump into a different series to talk about a different character that I think has a very similar type of evil. The series is A Song of Ice and Fire, written by George R. R. Martin, most famously known as Game of Thrones, the TV show. And I think, let me just preface this, I've also read and reviewed all the books here on the channel, you can check out, but I think this is another series that is full of really good characters, both protagonists and villains, and all in between, because there's so much morally grayness in this series that it's very hard to say, okay, this character is truly a villain or this character is truly a hero, because again, they do things that puts them in that gray area. Of course, there are some that you say, okay, that is definitely evil and that is definitely good. For example, you have Ramsay Bolton, definitely evil. However, I don't think he is a great villain, because for me, he is just evil and for the sake of pain and things like that. And I think that's just an easy way to not be like, to be a villain. But for example, Cersei is a character that I think was a villain, but at the same time, I feel too much pity and sadness for her as the series progresses for me to consider her a true villain. And so I think for this series, my favorite villain is actually Tywin Lannister, Cersei's father. Why is that? Well, I think he is a character that is very hard, kind of like Stannis Baratheon, but while Stannis is still like malleable, and you can see that he is hard because of his upbringing and being kind of discarded a lot of times, and like no one ever really thinking of him as worthy. Tywin had all of those things, and he is still that hard person that does not take anyone into consideration. He just wants what he wants, and he doesn't save any word, that he doesn't mince any words to get it. And that is why his family is all dysfunctional. That is why he ends up dead, because he didn't care about the consequences of what he was saying to his son or how it made his son feel. And I think he is a presence that exudes authority. However, I think that authority only comes because of fear and not really because people are in awe of him and therefore follow him. And this is a tangent, but speaking of this, it reminds me a lot about Sun Eater and how Marlowe keeps memorizing or trying to recall his lesson about how different people rule, if it's being led by fear or led by admiration and things like that. Tywin is 100% led by fear. He rules and he creates this fear on others, and it's only because of that that people follow him. But I don't think it was always like that. I think Tywin started off quite well, and I think there were things done to him through as his story goes by that made him the man that he is in the present, in the current part of the series. So I think this is a good example of a villain who just simply thinks he knows what is best for everyone, and he's not afraid of taking action and saying what he needs to say to get what he wants, even if that means harm to a lot of other people. So I like him because of that aspect, and I think that makes him a really good villain to create the tension in the plot for the series. And the last villain I need to talk about is from a series that I actually don't like it that much, but it's a series that is very famous in booktube and booktop and in the book world all over, and that is the First Law trilogy written by Joe Abercrombie. I have read the 3 books. I don't have any reviews here on the channel because I read them a long time ago. However, the character I'm talking about is very known, and it is Glokta. Glokta is one of our main POVs throughout the series, and he's this soldier that went into battle, got captured by the enemy, got tortured a lot, and eventually he was saved or released, I can't remember exactly, from his capture and returned to the kingdom. He raised a bit the ranks, however, due to his torture, he became super disfigured and with a lot of bitterness in him, which is completely understandable. But I think this whole background for the character is already a great start for it, because you can fully understand his actions, why he does what he does, and how evil he is, but is a different type of evil from, for example, Tywin Lannister or Roland from Stephen King's series. I mean, I think he is super despicable. I don't like him as a person, but I love him as a character, because he is one of those villains that you cannot not understand why he is doing these things. I mean, you may not agree, of course, you won't agree with the tortures that he does, all of the other things, but you will understand that he's just doing what was done to him over and over again. And even though I didn't like the story as a whole, I think Joe Abercrombie wrote every character in this book really well. I think the characters were done very well. Glokta especially. I think Glokta really shone through as an evil character, a villain character in a certain way. He may not be a villain in his own eyes, but I think in other perspectives he is very much a villain. And I think he is a slightly different type of villain in the way he causes the pain. Because, for example, Wheel of Time, Semirog, one other Forsaken of that series, she is known for causing pain and in very macabre ways, and she feels a lot of pleasure from it. She knows what she can do to cause that pain, whereas Glokta, he does it, he also feels a certain pleasure, but it's a pleasure from revenge of what was done to him, which I think is slightly different, and it gives a different layer to him, a more complex way of being evil. But yeah, I think Glokta is an amazing character, an amazing villain with a great backstory that makes him so understandable for the reader, even though we completely understand that the things he does are wrong. And I think that wraps up this video. Let me know, did you enjoy all of these villains? Do you disagree completely that any of them are villains, or that one should even be here on the top 5? Comment down below, because I think I covered a whole very different range of villains. We have the logical type that Ishamael is, where he chose to be a villain because why there is no point in waiting. Then you have the Shrike, who is this entity that is villainous, that is evil, that is scary by itself and doesn't even need to speak for you to fear it. And then you have three characters that are very human and that their flaws are what makes them evil. You have Roland, you have Tywin Lannister, you have Glokta, who, for very different reasons, they become quite villainous in itself. And they're very different types of villainous. One sacrifices people, one tortures people, and one just does what he wants with everyone, kind of. So I think they're all quite different, and I enjoy having this diversity in villains. But let me know. Comment down below what is your top 5. And if you're new, don't forget, subscribe, like the content, and you shall be seeing me on Thursdays and Sundays again. See you soon.